All right, so 3, you have 12x squared minus 3. So first thing that I can take out of each of them is a 3. So I have 4x squared minus 1. Now, I'm not finished here because I have a difference of 2 squares. So that means that I can factor out what's inside the parenthesis. So what number times itself gives you 2, or gives you 4? 2, so it's going to be 2x. So then this basically factors out to be, don't forget the 3 out in front, 2x plus 1, and then 2x minus 1. Because 2x times 2x gives me the 4x squared. Whenever I multiply the 2x and the negative 1 and the 2x and the positive 1, they cancel. So I don't have a middle. That's what makes it a perfect square, or a difference of 2 squares. And then negative 1 times positive 1 gives me the negative 1 that I have there. Okay? So anytime that I have 2 parts, look to see one, always look first to see if I can factor out a greatest common factor, and then go from there. On 13, everything's underneath the radical, so I can only multiply radicals with radicals and numbers outside that are on the outside. So I treat it just like any other fraction. So I'm going to multiply the top, so 7 times 14 is going to give me the square root of 98. So I have the square root of 98 on top, and then the bottom side I have the square root of 9, right? 3 times 3. So focus on one part at a time. So can I simplify, or is there a perfect square that I can take out of 98? Yes, what is it? 49. So on the top side, I have the square root of 49 times the square root of 2. On the bottom side, what's the square root of 9? 3. So now, what's the square root of 49? 7. So then I'm just going to have 7 times the square root of 2 all over 3. For 15, what I would do is I would do it by isolation because I don't have another x. So I would add 13 to both sides, and I would subtract x squared from both sides. So I'd have 14 equal to 2x squared. Okay. So then divide by 2. So then I have 7 equals x squared. I'm not finished because I need to take the square root of both sides. So since I'm actually solving it, I'm going to have plus or minus the square root of 7 is equal to x. Yep. So on 20, again, I would get the x squareds by themselves. So in doing that, for me personally, because I would rather keep my x squared positive, so I would send this over and subtract the 2x squared and subtract 1 from the other side. So in doing that, I'm going to have 9x squared equals a negative 1. So I want to get x by itself, so I'm going to divide both sides by 9. So whenever I do, I end up with x squared equal to negative, I'm going to put my negative 1 on its own with up at the top. Instead of putting it out in front, I'm going to leave it with my 1. Okay, because what am I going to have to do to both sides? Take the square root, right? So whenever I take the square root of a fraction, I take the square root of the top and I take the square root of the bottom. So then what happens is, what's the square root of negative 1? Square root of negative 1 is what? Yeah, just I, right? Okay, so square root of negative 1 is going to be the I. What's the square root of 9? 3. So my answer is just going to be plus or minus I over 3. Okay, that negative 1, since it's just the square root of negative 1, anytime you have the square root of a negative 1, you're going to turn that into I. Okay, so anytime you have a square root of negative 1, or remember, if you have like a negative 16, it's just going to be a plus or minus a 4 and then the I. Okay, you just factor out that negative 1 and you kind of make it its own. Alright, so on 26, biggest thing that you need to do is try not to think about everything all at once. Just focus on the first part and then focus on the back part. Making sure you give, since it's a negative I, go ahead and include that whenever we multiply. So then what's in the box, I'm just going to multiply everything. So 1 times 2 is 2. 1 times I is just going to be plus, and I'm just going to call it 1I. Negative 5I times 2 is going to be a negative 10I. And then negative 5I plus I is negative 5I squared. Now, I would just go ahead and continue moving on with what's inside now my circle. So I'm going to distribute that negative I. So I'm going to have negative 3I. And then I'm going to do the same thing and have a negative and a negative, make a positive 4I squared. So before you can kind of do as much or as little as you want. I'm going to kind of overwork this one, and I'm going to change my values of my I squared. So remember, I squared is the same thing as negative 1. So really I have 4 times negative 1. And then I have negative 5 times negative 1 there. Okay, so just what's highlighted, if it's I squared, so just like whenever we wrote a minute ago that we had the square root of negative 1 was I, if we have I squared, it's just going to be a negative 1. Okay, those are the two key parts that you're going to need to remember. That if you have the square root of negative 1, it's going to be I, and if you have I squared, it's just going to turn into a negative 1. So then, if we rewrite everything, I'm going to have 2 minus 9I, okay, 1 minus 10, and then negative 5 times negative 1 is a positive 5. Minus 3I, so nothing changed here, and then negative 4 or negative 1 times 4 is going to be a negative 4, and then just combine like terms. So all of my real numbers go together because it's in standard form. They're going to go first. So 2 plus 5 is 7. 7 minus 4 is 3. And then combine the i's, so negative 9i minus 3i is negative 12i, and that is in standard form. So with 25, I need to multiply the top and the bottom by the conjugate. So what's the conjugate of 2 plus 3i? What's the only thing I change with the conjugate? The plus becomes a minus and the minus becomes a plus, right? So it's going to be 2 minus 3i over 2 minus 3i. Okay, the only thing that changes here is the plus and the minus, and I have to have the same value. Okay, Okay, I'm not changing the value, I'm just changing what it looks like, because 2 minus 3i divided by 2 minus 3i is really just 1. Okay, I'm just changing how everything looks. So then I'm going to multiply on top, so I'm going to take 6 times 2 and get 12. I'm going to take 6 times negative 3i and get negative 18i. On the bottom side, you can multiply everything out. I'm going to have 2 times 2 is 4. What's going to happen whenever I go 2 times negative 3i and 3 times positive 2, or 3i times positive 2? Do you know? Yeah?
Would it make it negative 9i squared, and then it would be times negative 1, so it would be positive 9?
Yeah, whenever I do this part. So whenever I go minus 9i squared. Is that what you're saying? Yeah. Because what's going to happen in the middle? Like what's going to happen with the 6i and the negative 6i? They're just going to go away, right? It's kind of that middle step. So this part right here changes to 4 plus 9. Okay, because what is negative 9 times negative 1? Positive 9. So 4 plus 9 is just going to be 13. The top side, nothing changes. So I just have 12 minus 18i. Absolute value of, so if that is a plus, the absolute value of a complex number is just going to be the square root of whatever a squared is plus b squared. So a is negative 4, b is just 3. So I'm going to take the square root of negative 4 squared plus 3 squared. So negative 4 squared is 16. 3 squared is 9. So 16 plus 9 is the square root of 25. Now, since that's a perfect square, I can actually get a value. I don't have to stop here. So my answer is just going to be 5. Now, it's absolute value, so it's only going to have a positive answer because absolute value is the distance from 0, so distance cannot be negative. So with 30, the first thing you're going to have to do is to rationalize it. So the first thing I'm going to need to do is go 4 plus 3i and do the same thing with 4 plus 3i. Okay, so whenever I do, on the top side, I'm going to have 12 plus 9i minus 4i and then minus 3i squared. On the bottom side, I'm going to end up with 16 minus 9i squared. Is negative 3 times positive 3 is negative 9 I squareds. So then that's just going to be negative 3 times negative 1. This is going to be negative 9 times negative 1. So on the top, I'm going to have 12 plus 3, so that's 15, plus 5i and then 16 plus 9, so 25. Now I'm going to simplify it. So if I actually, this is one that I wouldn't leave it like stacked. So if I have 15 over 25 plus 5 over 25i, I have 3 over 5 plus 1 over 5. So I'm going to plug it into my formula the same way. There's my A, there's my B. So I'll take 3/5 squared plus 1/5 squared, and all of it's underneath the radical. So 9 over 25 plus 1 over 25. Now I will tell you, you won't have anything like that. Whoop, my fault. You won't have one like that on the... So, same way, still the same formula as far as a squared plus b squared. So, what's a? Square root of 2. What's b? What number's in front of your I? -1. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to take the square root of square root of 2 squared plus -1 squared. So what's going to happen to your square root and your squared? It's just going to cancel, and it's going to be what? 2, right? So I have the square root of 2. What's -1 squared, or -1 times -1? +1. So what's 2 plus 1? So my answer is just the square root of 3.